Look, I'm guilty of a testing crime, and I know that you are too, many of you. As software developers, we're always trying to move fast, write more code, get more things done, deliver more features, fix more bugs, go, go, go. And if you've seen a lot of my content, you'll know that I talk about testing an awful lot, and I do take it seriously. Yet here I am telling you that I committed a testing crime. You see, it's not that I decided to skip writing tests, it's that I decided to write a different kind of test so that I could get myself some confidence but save myself some time. So this was a calculated decision. I decided that the risk versus reward, so the amount of time that I'd have to put in to get the confidence back out, was worth it. And that means that I was writing a style of test that I thought would be beneficial to allow me to keep moving but still give me confidence over the code that I was changing. So yes, a testing crime in this case, but it wasn't that I went all the way to just skip writing tests altogether. And I know that some of you do that, and you shouldn't. You should write tests for your code. So what happened in my situation? Well, in my previous videos, which I'll link above, I've been talking about that I've been writing these tests that would give me confidence over these ASP.NET Core APIs that I've been writing. And because we're iterating really fast on our project, I didn't have time to go dissect everything, go and write really granular unit tests. And a lot of the stuff that I have is interfacing with my SQL databases, and quite frankly, I don't think that writing unit tests over a boundary that's going to execute SQL queries is very valuable at all. What I did write were functional tests or integration tests that would go launch containers, go actually exercise the routes of my application, so from the top level of the app all the way down to the database and back up to return an HTTP result. However, when you write tests like this that cover so much, that exercise so much of your code base, it's basically impossible to be able to write really granular assertions, because if you had to test everything in detail along the way and actually assert it, your number of assertions would be ridiculous. So I traded off having granular assertions for more code that I could exercise in a single test. And guess what? It worked for a while, but it did end up catching me off guard the other day, and I wanted to share that experience with you. So before we jump over to Visual Studio, please consider subscribing to my newsletter. I send it out on the weekend. It will have updates from the week, including software engineering topics, C# topics, and some of the content that I've been putting out. It'll have community spotlights as well and some learning resources that aren't just from me. It's only a quick 5-minute read, so I hope you enjoy it and I hope you consider subscribing. With that said, let's jump over to Visual Studio and check out where I messed up. Alright, so I'm here in Visual Studio, and if you've seen my other videos, I've been talking about how I set up some functional tests to be able to kick off some testing infrastructure that kind of simulates a production environment, except using test containers. If we look at the constructor of this test class, we can see that we have some fixtures passed in, so this is an xunit concept. And then these are details specific to my application, but I've created this builder pattern to be able to set up some of the test data and the test containers so that I have some infrastructure to work with. And with this builder pattern, it does seed some data so that I can pretend that I'm working with something real. In a real production environment, we might be talking about millions of records, so instead of actually using that, I just have a small subset of the data that I populate. Now, I'm going to jump down to a test that's down here at the bottom that talks about getting a recipe through my route. So this line here on line 119 is actually calling the route through an API client, and by the time we're running this line here, we actually have an entire ASP.NET Core application up and running and connected to the MySQL test container. And yes, this route name is a little bit ridiculous. I kind of realized in hindsight that I should not have a get in here because it is a get method, so I will change that. With that said though, this line here actually hits the server and pulls back a result that we would go parse with this assertion here. And we're looking for this DTO, which has get recipe details response defined, and that will have the recipe information that we're pulling back. Now, this particular test method actually says in the name that the basic details are asserted. So while I'm not actually validating every single thing that's coming back as the response here, I am looking at a handful of things. The other thing worth mentioning is that the actual test data I'm using, I'm not actually defining something very specific. I'm actually just asking for any recipe that this user can see. And then these variables here are actually just the paging and offset. So I'm saying start at 0 and pull 1 record. So these lines of code right here actually just filter for a single recipe, any recipe that this user can see, and it checks that we have one single recipe. So you can already see that by not being very specific at all with my test setup, I'm just saying I want to go pull any recipe back that I can see, and I'm going to double check that there's some basic information that comes back. So yes, there are assertions, but these are very simplistic. They are not going to be very brittle, and because I'm not looking for anything specific because of these lines of code right here, this is just really going to be a test that exercises a bunch of code and not actually assert on a lot of the details. Now, the risk that I want to call out with doing this is that this can give you a false sense of confidence if you're assuming it's doing too much. I've already stated a couple of times that I wanted to write tests like this just so that I could actually exercise a lot of code. So this did fulfill the purpose that I was going after. However, it only gets you so far because when you start making some other types of changes and you don't have other test coverage, say like unit tests or other functional tests with more test data, you will run into situations where you're just not covered. And that's exactly what happened to me. Let's go have a look at what this DTO actually looks like. So this is the model for get recipe details response. It has a single recipe details on it. So if I go into that, we can see that we have a bunch of information on it, and we're going to have this ingredient range. So to talk about the change that actually messed me up, I was trying to do some SQL queries in bulk instead of doing them one at a time. And that for me was going to alter that I had way down in my repository that's pulling code back from the database, a method that would loop over more records and return an aggregate of them instead of just a single record. So if we look at ingredient range, this is just going to define some of the food IDs and the range that these foods can be generated on for a recipe. But if we go back, we can see that we're talking about having an entire array of ingredients. And that's because, if you think about it, a recipe has ingredients. It's made up of multiple things, and some recipes, you could argue, are just made up of a single ingredient. But the point is, this can be multiple things, and most of the time, it is multiple things. Okay, cool. So this is right at the level of the route, so at the topmost part of the application, if you were to think about it like a stack. Now, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom. We're going to go look at the repository that's responsible for pulling this information back. Okay, so we're in the repository, and I'm going to explain the change that I made that actually caused this funny bug to show up in my code and not get caught by my test. So I had just mentioned that I wanted to change some of my queries to actually pull some stuff back in bulk, and the reason for this is that I can make fewer trips to the database to get the same information. When I was examining my code, I saw that this method here, get by recipe definition IDs, unordered async, was actually called many times, and it was actually just using a single ID passed in, which meant that if we had to call it 10, 100, 1,000 times, we were actually just pulling back one set per ID, and that meant that we had to go do many round trips to the database. Instead, I said, well, instead of doing this in a loop and making multiple queries, why don't I just go run one query and pull back all the information at once? However, it's going to be way faster than making multiple round trips for each time that I'd want to go look up by a single ID that you'd see on line 127. Now, to go make this actually work wasn't actually too difficult, but there was a bug in my code which I will touch on, but the result that I ended up seeing was that every single call to this, and I noticed it on the API when I was actually looking at my app and looking at the results, was that every recipe was coming back with just one ingredient. Now, it caught me off guard because I do have a couple of recipes that are things like boiled eggs, and boiled eggs do just have one ingredient. But the more I was clicking around in my application, I realized, wait a second, it's impossible that all of these recipes just have a single ingredient, and then it dawned upon me that I am my own worst enemy. And because I realized I just made this change recently and I hadn't seen this problem before, I knew that I had to go back through my commits and check to see the code that was altered in this particular spot. Now, the bug was actually one single character that was incorrect, and I had to go figure out why I was only getting one ingredient per recipe. The actual logic to go pull back ingredients across many recipes was working, but the many recipes only ever maxed out at one single ingredient. Now, it might not be obvious from looking at this, and this is the fixed code, but this is where the problem was. I had mentioned before, if you look at the pattern that I'm using here, that this is technically the offset, and this is actually the page size. What I had in my code before was this. I was saying, go to offset 0, take a page size of 1, and go get me the things that match this recipe definition ID. And this was totally due to a copy and paste error, so I feel a little bit silly about that. But the impact of that was that I was only ever pulling back one ingredient because I said cap the page size at 1. So the fix was quite literally this right here by making int.max value. And the interesting thing is that if I made this change, no test broke, which tells me no tests were actually covering this, which is exactly why it escaped in the first place. Now, this is a good point to pause and think about what I was saying earlier about my test coverage. I did walk us through this example from before, where we had this get recipe API test and actually pull back a specific recipe. This particular route will in fact go exercise that code. However, none of the assertions actually make sure that there are more than one ingredient. And if we double check here, we can actually see that we're ensuring that we have at least one ingredient. That's why it says not empty, but it never checked for more than one ingredient. The really funny part is that after I made the change, if I go back here and I put int.max value, I said, okay, I'm going to go make sure that I can have multiple ingredients pulled back. And I want to verify that in my test. So if I go back to the test, I actually did try making this look something like this code here that uses a method that I have that just kind of extends some xunit that does some greater than checks. While I made this change here, and I corrected the code, now this test was failing. It was still saying that nothing was coming back with more than one ingredient. And I said, that's impossible. I know that I actually fixed the page sizing issue. Why is this test not passing? And that leads us to one more interesting thing about writing functional tests with dummy data. I'm going to show you some of the code that runs as part of that builder pattern that I have that seeds some of the data into my test data for running tests. And this particular one is going to be responsible for populating the recipes that I have in my test data. What was interesting about that is that, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, this code wasn't actually here. And we had a single food that was getting pulled off of this. Again, you can see this pattern with the offset and the page size. This was like this. And we had a single food coming off, so not two. And then we had this here, which this is going to be hard for folks to read, and I don't expect you to know the structure of my record types here, but I essentially had the ingredients here with one single ingredient. So of course my test was still going to fail, even though I had fixed the bug. All of my test data being generated only ever had one ingredient in it. And that means that even if I did go write those tests early on and try to make sure that I could go assert the exact ingredients coming back from my recipes, I would still be testing that there is this exact one ingredient. So the lesson here is that my test data also needs to be more diverse so that I can cover more scenarios, and that way I can write tests on those scenarios as well. If I undo all of the changes that I just did on there, this is actually what the new setup looks like and actually has two ingredients. I used some different units because I told myself, hey, maybe in the future you're going to want to look at some different units here as well. And that way I have a little bit more variety being generated in my test data. Okay, so now that I've made a change to the test data being set up, I've actually fixed the bug in the repository, and I could go back and change that functional test that actually hits the route. I said, well, I'm still not satisfied because I caught myself in a trap and I committed a testing crime. So what's the punishment for the testing crime? Well, it's going to write the proper tests. In this particular case, I decided I'm still going to stick with some functional tests, but I'm actually going to write functional tests over the recipe definition food repository. So that means I am going to be explicitly exercising this repository with some functional tests and not just at the route level where I have a lot less control over what's going on. You'll see that I still use this builder pattern, and now that I actually seeded some dummy recipe data with multiple ingredients, I knew that I could go write the needed tests to ensure that it's doing what's expected. If I scroll down a little bit more, we can see what some of my tests look like, and you can see that I have looking up with a single ID and we're going to get multiple ingredients back, and looking up by multiple IDs and getting multiple ingredients back as well. So if I expand this, we can see some similar patterns that we saw earlier in this video, where I am going to go look up 2 recipes that will exist in the data set. And then when I actually go do the lookup for those recipes, so I'm passing in that collection of IDs here, which should be 2 because this assertion says so, I'm expecting that I get 2 results back. Now the results are per recipe that we're looking up, and each result per recipe is going to have the set of ingredients that are part of that recipe. I told myself it's not just enough to make sure that we got the 2 recipes back, because the bug was actually that each recipe only had a single ingredient. So you can see right here, I have this dedicated assertion that says we are looking for more than 1 ingredient, and then I'm just doing a quick sanity check on every ingredient that comes back that it's actually matching the recipe definition ID. And that way, if some of my grouping at the SQL level was actually a little bit messed up, and while I was looking up multiple recipes, I wasn't actually accidentally going to be mixing the ingredients across the recipes, this part of the test here will prove that for me. And there we have it. That was the testing crime that I committed. And just to quickly summarize what happened, I had written some functional tests on purpose that would actually go exercise a lot of code, but not assert a lot of the details. This was so that I could get enough confidence to keep iterating, but I did end up catching myself off guard by introducing a bug that was not caught, even though that code was being exercised. And that's because it was not being asserted on. I also mentioned that it's really important that when you're simulating some test data, that you're actually making it representative of the real scenario that you're trying to look at. Again, otherwise this might give you some false confidence depending on what you're testing and what you're verifying. And finally, my punishment for committing this testing crime was actually going to write proper tests that would assert this particular situation. So I hope that you found this insightful. Please remember to write tests along the way. It's okay if you're going to have some escapes in some of your test coverage, but remember, you need to go back and pay the penalty for not having the right test coverage. So go add those tests if you mess up. Thanks for watching, happy testing, and we'll see you next time.